Good morning, everyone. My name is Nelsiwe Mpapane, and I'm a PhD candidate at Nelson Mandela University. And today I'll be presenting a concise portion of my research, which comprises of a systematic literature review titled Inclusivity as a Practice and a Concept for Transformative Change to Conservation in 10 Southern African Countries. What do we know? So globally, we're facing a state where critical limits are looming. And collectively, as a planetary, if we want to see better outcomes, we need to change our ways. At the same time, we know that biodiversity challenges are closely linked to global sustainability challenges, such as poverty, inequality, food insecurity, climate change. And as a result, we need to we need to be cognizant of that. To counter these challenges, the call for transformative change has gained a lot of interest in literature. This became more relevant when the CBD Aichi biodiversity targets have not been achieved by the 2020 deadline. The IPCC also echoed for transformative systematic change along with the IPBES. Transformative change is defined as a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. It's very important to note that transformative change is not a destination. However, it's more of experiences and decisions that we take boldly so on a day-to-day basis. There's been a broad strand of literature that tries to come together to synthesize as to how we can make transformative change happen in many conservation areas. However, what remains common in all of this literature is the need to apply inclusive governance practices. We see inclusive governance as a leverage point in some reports, but we also see it as seeds for transformative change, and it's discussed differently in so many papers as well, or documents. And because of that, inclusivity in the context of conservation, especially in the Southern African context, we need to be really specific. This huge disparity in conservation governance between developed and developing countries creates a bit of some complexities for us when we pursuing conservation. We are still stuck with tensions from colonial rule according to the fortress conservation approaches. We also sit with a lot of financial burdens, which makes us heavily reliable on tourism as a form of income. We also have power and political conflicts at a national, but also at a local level, which often undermine efforts that may be in line with inclusive practices. So this study reviewed literature published in the past 22 years that focus on inclusivity towards conservation actions. The methodology process was quite lengthy, but we had 3 questions that we wanted to answer. Firstly, we wanted to look at how the concept of inclusivity has been used in the conservation of natural resources. We also wanted to look at what are the drivers for implementing inclusivity or inclusive approaches in conservation. But most importantly, we also wanted to look at some of the most important factors that one needs to consider when implementing inclusive approaches into different conservation areas. As a team, we sat down to try and create boundaries as to how we want to define inclusivity, because as you may already know, there are other concepts like convival, mosaic, integrative conservation that do exist. However, we were specific as to how we want to view this whole concept. We chose a timeline, 2000 to 2022. We chose the countries, inbound countries that we wanted to focus on, and we ran a search on Web of Science and Scopus. We got around 1,000 papers, read the title and the abstract, and we also had an exclusion criteria as we proceeded, which led us to 94 papers that were quite important when read in full. But after the exclusion criteria, we had only 37 papers that were eligible for this report. However, the 94 papers are quite important for the second phase of the study. For our analysis, we used a combination of narrative analysis, the timeline methodology to show this, root cause analysis, and a combination of deductive and inductive coding on @TI. So some of the results, as you can see on the graph, the green are the eligible studies, the 94 studies, and in blue, the 37 studies that we got. 80% of the studies that we reviewed were published only after the year 2011. However, majority of them were only published after the year 2016. Geographically, South Africa had the most papers, followed by Zimbabwe, but we also had a fair amount of cross-country studies, which was quite nice, and Zambia having the least. Do I have anyone from Zambia here? We need to talk. So conceptually, inclusivity was discussed differently across all of these studies. However, the core foundation of inclusivity was epistemic inclusivity, which goes beyond just mere integration. So here we played a lot of, or they laid a lot of emphasis in terms of the underlying beliefs, the paradigms, the values, worldviews of people that shape how we view conservation or even practice it as a whole. This also laid emphasis as to not fitting people into the same dominant paradigm in conservation. From the science and research space, individual inclusivity was quite dominant because here they used a lot of people with unique skills or expertise to be part of their team members to contribute to some of the challenges that we have in the Southern African context. It was also discussed from a community, but also inter-community level, where emphasis was placed on meaningful inclusion of community members, especially on ongoing decision-making, especially when it has major impact on their livelihoods or their safety. In the inter-community level, there was also an aspect of fairness and equity between communities and recognizing that community characteristics are different, and therefore we need to approach them that way. From an institutional level, practices of inclusivity were either enabled or limited based on the policy or the design of those institutions. We also had an aspect of intergenerational inclusivity, which I think Isa touched on a little bit, but this really reflected the interdependencies of the generation from the past, the generation that lives today, and also in the future. So what happened in the past mirrors how we are practicing conservation currently. So whatever we do, we also need to be cognizant of the future as well. It's a lot of responsibility, I know. There were also 6 important actions that were associated with inclusivity. However, I'm not going to play a lot of emphasis into it because of time constraints. This was true, meaningful collaboration, to be specific, between the state and communities. Balancing of local and global needs. A lot of the global interest failed to appreciate societal concerns and also political needs on a national and also local level. And they also failed to include local ecological knowledge. There was also the recognition of multiple natures and cultures. Restorative justice, emphasis that places need to recognize that people have been historically impacted and are still living in unfair circumstances in most of these countries, our country as well. There was also the action of expanding the notion of community, which I have already touched on, which emphasizes that communities are not homogeneous. And the last one being the reconciliation of values and norms, which was quite important. I think George touched on one of the studies that had to do with participation done through 𝐷oxa, which is quite important. A lot of the initiatives that were done in Botswana did not have a lot of success because they did not understand how things had to be done within certain communities. But also remember, when I said inter-community as well, I meant that some communities may not participate in some of those procedures while others may. So it's important to understand. We then started looking at the drivers, which was quite an interesting activity for me. But I also just need to acknowledge the discontinued temporal linearity here, as drivers, for instance, that happened in the early 2000s or before that do have an impact as to what is happening currently here. So in the first 5 years, the main causal factor, we looked at causal factors as direct or indirect drivers, but the main causal factor around this time was environmental and biodiversity concerns. So this was water scarcity and a bit of some forest management. And the procedure here was highly procedural, as a great focus on the response was who is going to participate, how are they going to participate, when are they going to do it. It was more of a top-down procedure. In the following 5 years, 2006 to 2010, the main causal factor here was the role of engagement and participation. There was a lack of ongoing engagements in decision-making that were related to natural resources, and this created like a huge gap between miscommunication in communities and the state, causing a lot of conflict as well. The response was a combination of procedural measures, but a lot of recognition to local livelihoods and cultures that they uphold, and some of the socio-economic factors that happen in this area. The most interesting study there was 2002, where they assessed CBNRM in Botswana and Zambia, and this is where a lot of the context came out from. In the next 5 years, 2011 and 15, there was a combination of causal factors, environmental and biodiversity still following on, but there was socio-economic factors that start coming in, and also connected by meaningful engagements and participation. We still see that also in this area, this was when the millennial ecosystem assessment area was happening. So a lot of communities or research focused on the benefits of nature towards people. So a lot of the response here was procedural manners, but a great focus on the recognition towards land rights, democratic rights, historical injustice, and livelihood needs, and a bit of some paradigm shift. And we see this in a study, I think this was Steph's study in 2014, that applied SAM in Kruger National Park, but also an assessment in the Transfrontier Park that looked at how the paradigm shift has made an impact on biodiversity status and human well-being. The last few years are quite dramatic, if you ask me. From 2016 to the year 2002, we see a whole combination of causal factors that I have already mentioned. But another one that comes into play is international policy and governance impact. We are aware that this probably had been happening all over the years, but we start seeing a lot of it being published in writing around those times. We start accounting for equitable benefits sharing of ecosystem services, and we also start seeing what Benjamin was talking about, conflict between conservation and also agriculture. There was a combination of procedural manners and the recognition of livelihood needs, but a bit of some plurality in how conservation should be viewed in the Southern African context. We also play emphasis into worldviews, the values, the norms, and the cultures as to communities in these areas. The last question then put together a conceptual framework that you can work on. So here we started looking at the important factors, especially in the context of Southern African countries. And we grouped them into 6 different dimensions: the social cultural dimension, governance dimension, social demographic dimensions, institutional, ethical and legal, and the implementation. So this is all coming from discussions within all of these studies as to what was important, what could we have done better. And for example, in the social-cultural dimension, one of the most spoken about aspect or factor was perceived trust. Does the state trust communities? Does the communities trust the state? Do people within communities also trust themselves? There was a lot of power dynamics that happened, especially on a local level. So all of these factors have a lot of context into it. This is just a summary of how it looks like. But also in the institutional and organization department, we also see that Trust comes up a lot. Do colleagues trust each other in a lot of initiatives that are happening around the Southern African context? But at the same time, we also see that for an organization to apply inclusivity or inclusive approaches successfully, there needs to be reflective learning and a bit of some adaptive management implemented into their strategies. As I said, there's a lot of context for each and every one. But what I basically want to show here is that I use the analogy of a hose pipe. You know, when you're gardening and you start recognizing that the volume of your water starts reducing, the first thing that you do is you start walking back to see where the bend is. You could be sitting with power dynamics, maybe not within your institution, but within the community in itself. You could be sitting with a misinterpretation of languages, because a lot of communities did mention that the language that was being used was one that we could not understand. We understood what you wanted us to contribute to. However, in the ongoing process, we don't really see our role because there's a misinterpretation also within our values and languages as well. Or what Martin spoke about, right move, wrong timing. You could be sitting with the matter of timing. And the last question is, where's your pipe blocked? Is what you need to answer. Thank you so much.